Welcome to the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility and the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile on the Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips, and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com. This week's guest is Adam Boxer. Adam is a science teacher, an edtech startup founder, and an educational consultant. Adam is an internationally recognized expert in practical pedagogy and is highly sought after as a teacher trainer and leadership coach. Adam is also the co-host of the They Behave For Me podcast and the education director of Carousel Learning, an innovative online learning platform that harnesses evidence from the cognitive sciences to boost student outcomes. Adam is also a very close friend of mine, and it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Adam, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Adam, what is learning?
Starting with the easy questions then. It's one of those words that is somewhat resistant to precise definition. And I guess depends on who you ask. Like in day-to-day language, learning doesn't have a precise technical definition. It means, you say to someone, what did you learn about? And they say, oh, I learned about the Romans today. You're like, okay, that's cool. Some kind of information has been transmitted, and that would suffice on the day-to-day. More technically, I think it's important to, you mentioned that this is a podcast about cognitive science. It's important to situate different levels of understanding what the word learning means. So cognitive science is a branch of psychology that deals with thinking, with learning, with memory, with the mind. But it kind of sits between two other levels of psychology. So the top level of psychology is behaviorism. So this is kind of where you study what people do, and you sort of ignore what's going on inside their head. So it's like, if I put a speed camera on the motorway, do people slow down? That's like classic behaviorism stuff. If I make that speed camera yellow, does that make it more or less likely that someone would slow down? And you're sort of less interested in the process that's really going on in someone's head and just looking at the kind of observable outcomes. You might theorize about it, but really the thing you're interested in is those observable outcomes, which is what psychologists call behavior. So it's something that a person or any other organism does.
Is that what you mean by, you said top level of psychology? Do you mean like most observable or something?
Top level of this kind of area of psychology, where we're looking at kind of human activity. It's the most observable, it's the most concrete, it's the least theoretical, I guess. And I'm stereotyping and summarizing a little bit, but that's kind of that's the A-level SparkNotes version. You then have
the best psychology is behaviorism. Next,
yeah, that kind of stuff. You can then draw a lot further and say, well, I am really interested in the brain, and I'm interested in these things in the brain that are called neurons, and I'm interested in what neurons do. So a neuron is a cell, and your brain is made of many millions of these cells, and they communicate with each other. I guess they're either on or they're off, and they form these networks and stuff like that. And a neuroscientist or a computational neuroscientist would be interested in the way those interact. Now, for the behaviorist, the reason why this is important is because for the behaviorist, what learning means is a change in behavior. So let's say, I've got a tortoise. She has a nice enclosure. And she knows when I walk over that she thinks there's going to be food, and she goes to the corner of her enclosure, which is where her food comes. And that is what a behaviorist would call learning, right? That tortoise has learned because I can see something happening. The neuroscientist might be less interested in what they can see happening in terms of behavior, because they'd be saying, right, well, the key thing here is whether what's happened to the nerve cells, right? These neurons in the brain, like, have we formed more connections? Have we made more nerve cells? Have we myelinated a different nerve or whatever? And because those nerve cells change in response to external stimuli or occurrences. So that's kind of what they're interested in when they talk about learning. The cognitive scientist kind of sits somewhere in between and thinks, yes, we are sort of interested in neurons, but that's a bit removed from the humanity of it all. And yes, we're interested in behavior, but not all things that we would class as learning result in a behavioral difference. If I watch a documentary about the sinking of the Bismarck, my life might not change at all, but my something has definitely changed. So,
Or even if I sit and think about something, right? Something has happened. If I work something out in my mind from a behaviorist point of view, they would say, well, I don't care about that. Is that right?
in the caricatured version of behaviorism that I'm presenting, they would say, yeah, it's just like, forget it, move it to the side. So anyway, that middle level cognitive science, they tend to define learning then in terms of a change in. So let's give you another example. Okay, let's say we watch our documentary about I don't know, pick a topic. What are we watching our documentary about?
Cognitive science and agility podcasts. Too
Okay.
specific?
Okay, yeah, and yeah. So let's say we go on a course about agile development, and we learn about sprint meetings, right? And I go home and I tell my wife, I say, oh, there's an amazing course. I learned about these, sprint meetings and scrums and all, stand ups and points and storyboarding and all sorts of really cool stuff. And she says, oh yeah, that's amazing. And then we have our dinner. And then the next day, I don't really do all that much with it. And then the day after, I don't do that much. And it's not till about 6 weeks later that I decide, oh, now's the time I'm gonna start my startup or whatever. And someone says, oh, you're going to use, agile development techniques. And I'm like, oh, yes, definitely. And they say, which ones? And I'm like, oh God, I can't quite remember. It was a long time ago. I'm sorry. I might need to go revisit my notes. Now, what one could ask is, well, when I first did that session, I could talk meaningfully about it. Okay, so maybe from a behaviorist perspective, I've done something. In terms of my neurons, definitely something's changed. Something's happened inside my brain, because almost by definition, like I can't do something if there's nothing happening in my brain. But in a very real sense, I've not learned anything. I've done something, and something has happened. Something's changed in my brain. But 6 weeks later, it's not there anymore. So a cognitive scientist would say, well, that we're not going to classify that as learning. You've not learned it. We're going to classify learning as a change in long-term memory. And if nothing in your long-term memory has changed, nothing has been learned. And here I'm using the definition that I'm taking straight from a paper from 2006 by professors Paul Kirshner, Sweller, and Clark. So John Sweller and Michael, begins with a name, Michael or Matthew Clark. I don't remember, something Clark.
Not Andy Clark, the cognitive scientist.
Different person.
Different Clark.
And this is a 2006 paper. It's called Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Doesn't Work. And they're talking about the best way to teach, but obviously they have to first define the outcome of said teaching. And they define the outcome of teaching as learning, and the definition of learning as a change in long-term memory. Now, again, this is very loose and very basic. So, for example, one of the critiques, it is a bit pedantic because the meaning should be clear to people, but people say, well, what about forgetting? Then you've changed your long-term memory. You can't define that as learning. So you could call that then maybe a positive change in long-term memory. And then people say, well, we have qualms with the idea of positive. What if a person experiences trauma? You don't want to call that a positive change in long-term memory, despite the fact that it is a change. So sometimes people talk about an increase in long-term memory. I think that's probably the and then people talk about like not necessarily different types of learning, but where things start to get bogged down is they say things like, okay, well, if I say to you, the word mashua is Kenyan for boat. Okay. And 6 weeks later, I test you on it and you've still retained that information. So according to the cognitive science definition, then yeah, you've learned something. But have you learned Kenyan? Like you've learned, I guess, like one word in Kenyan. It feels very rote. It's not connected to anything you know about anything else. You've forgotten already, haven't you?
Mashua.
Ah, good work. So there are tricky nuances that need to be encountered, but broadly our kind of most basic surface level definition of learning then is going to be an increase in long-term memory. I think that's probably where I'd stop.
A good starting point. Is there a difference between learning facts and information versus learning skills?
Good question. And there's quite a Did you just fist bump yourself? You asked the
I just
question.
fist bumped myself. Yeah, I'm really happy that I asked a good
Are
question.
we going to do that the whole way through? Or is that one off?
Yeah, I think we will.
Okay, good. It, the problem is here we're really going to get stuck when it comes to definitions. So could you give me an example of a skill when you talk about skill?
So I'll think about a skill being a sequence of actions. Could be mental actions, but it could be physical actions which I carry out, which might rely on facts and information, but are separate. I.e., if I know that Adam Boxer is a teacher, that is a fact. Whereas if you have a ability to talk to Adam Boxer and ask him good questions for a teacher, that's a skill that I'm enacting.
Okay, so let's say the question that you ask me is there a difference between learning facts and skills, right? Yeah, would you agree that knowledge of what the word "what" means is a fact?
Yes, I would.
Right. Well, what about the definition of the word "is"
Sure.
and the etc. etc. And substantively, there's no reason psychologically to distinguish between knowledge of the word "what" or knowledge of the word "would" or knowledge of the word "painting" from the ability to turn all of those into one question, because it's just the stringing together of different facts. So one could conceptualize a skill as the stringing together of a series. Let's forget the physical stuff like how to ride a bike or whatever. But in terms of like mental abilities, cognitive abilities, which is what we're talking about, one could quite happily conceptualize the idea of a skill as just the stringing together of facts. And the way that cognitive scientists talk about skills is as an outcome of possessing a series of pieces of information. I don't love the word fact because it indicates like trivia, whereas I just talk about like pieces of information. Like for example, knowing there is a relationship between the amount of light a plant gets and the height it can grow to is a fact. Right, but most people would say, "Oh, well, that's not really a fact. A fact is like, what's the capital of Australia or whatever." So it's a package of information, and the way cognitive scientists tend to conceptualize skills is an outcome of the brain's ability to tie together different packets of information. So when an expert gardener looks at a garden, and they're looking at the light, and they're looking at the types of plants, and they're thinking about the soil pH and all of that stuff. It's a mysterious and magical process, but at root, functionally, all it is it's the tying together of a series of facts. And they tend to talk about these things called schema, which is a network of interconnected facts. And having those facts, deeply embedded in your long-term memory and deeply connected to each other makes it much easier to apply those in the real world and to think about them in a more complex way, which then manifests itself in what's called a skill. So by and large, the people that you see and you think about as being highly skilled at a particular thing are really just possessing of a really, really deep and interconnected kind of knowledge base about that thing.
So I'm thinking about the teams that I work with, and the work I do tends to be with software teams who are collaborating, and all the skills that are needed to do a piece of work, to write a piece of software, to get something out to a customer, all the skills sit between those people, which means, I guess you're saying that all the different factual pieces of information that every software developer, tester, designer, whatever has, all schemas up into a set of skills that they might have. And then together the team has an overall ability to deliver a piece of work or to get something done. So in the agile world, we talk about teams learning stuff. Like, we need to learn about our customer. We need to learn which domain we're in. We need to learn how our technology works. We need to learn how we work with each other. And so would you say that is all just a case of like getting the right bits of information, the right, not facts because it's not trivia, but like the right packets of, and if we just got all of the right information in the right place, we would have everything we needed. And there's no need to manipulate our learning or think about it at a higher level than all the facts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily the most useful conceptualization. I think the, the bit that's useful is to know that building up a large mental database of knowledge about your particular context is going to be useful to you at solving problems in that context and thinking creatively and ambitiously, and sometimes critically about that particular area. But no one's surprised when you give them concrete examples. If you've just got a new developer in who you want to work on back end stuff and has spent ages working on front end stuff, right? Like obviously they're going to take more time to get back into the back end stuff. Let's say you just bring someone in. Let's say you're selling a product that deals with, like you're using Stripe or whatever. You've just brought someone in who knows really well how to use Stripe. You can expect at your sprint planning meeting them to have better ideas about the connection that you've got with Stripe than someone who's never used Stripe before in their life, right? Not necessarily because one is smarter than the other, not necessarily because one is more critical thinking in a generalized sense, but because they just know more stuff about that particular area.
So there's a distinction between necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. And I'm wondering if that's relevant here. That I might say that it's necessary for me to have a large base of facts before I can perform anything that we would call a skill, right? I need to know some stuff about the payments platform Stripe before I can integrate it with my software. But is it sufficient? Is all I need to know lots of facts, or is there like another element to having a skill that allows me to use all those facts?
No, it's not all you need, but it's probably all you're in control of.
So what's the stuff that I'm not in control of that I need?
Your kind of baseline cognitive processes that you can't affect or modify. So, for example, executive function in what's called the Baddeley model of cognition, your brain kind of does different things and the way it uses and manipulates its long-term memory, and the way you pay attention to this and then not that, and the way you filter out this but keep that or whatever. And a part of your brain, it's not a physical part, but it's a part of the model of your brain that does that. It's called the central executive. Now, central executive gets better at functioning up until a person is aged 25 or 26, and then slowly declines. Right? Like you don't have. Now, that's not in your control. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't train it. There was a big fashion a little while ago for like brain training programs, and they don't work. When you do randomized control trials, they don't work. They don't do anything. So you can't increase the capacity of your working memory. The only thing really that you can control, you also can't necessarily change how quickly you learn new facts. Right? Different people have different, what you might call IQ, or what sometimes is called fluid intelligence, the ability to pick up new knowledge. Partly that's dependent on the amount of knowledge you already have in that area. But partly there's something that we can't necessarily explain or account for that makes a difference. And a lot of learning and thinking is kind of mysterious, that we don't necessarily know what's going to stick, what's not going to stick, what will still be there in 6 weeks, what won't be there in 6 weeks, what will be heard, what will be misheard. We don't necessarily know all of those things. So I think you're right that it's necessary and not sufficient, but it might be that the other stuff we don't really understand and we might not necessarily be able to control.
Yeah, it's such an interesting area because when we think about it, it goes against my understanding of or my intuitions about how skill learning works or how thinking goes. The question is as someone who's managing a team or who's trying to influence learning in some way, should I be focusing on something that isn't just teaching of information, or should I be teaching on this other thing? It sounds like from what you're saying, the only thing that I can really help control in the people I'm working with is the information, the facts, the bits that I give them. And then everything else is outside of my control.
If you can give me an example of something else, that with the first thing is that we could probably reduce it to a set of pieces of information and knowledge. And the second thing is that, let's take creativity as an example. Yeah. Can I not teach them creativity or whatever? And the answer is no. You just can't. It's not a generic skill that can be taught. And there's no evidence that suggests up until no evidence at least that I've seen when you do a randomized control trial that creativity is something that can be taught. And when you do studies and you look at the things that people are more creative about, it almost always turns out that the things they're more creative about are the things they know a lot about. So you tend to have the people who are most creative in a domain are the people who have reached their way to the end of the domain, who already know loads about that domain. A great example is startup founders, right? When you think about the startup founder, you think about someone who is creative, someone who is energetic, someone who's ambitious, someone who's willing to put in the hours. And if you go on LinkedIn, that's what you see, right? But if you look at, the Harvard Business Review have done big research onto the age of successful startup founders, and it's like mid to late 40s, and these aren't the people wandering around in tracksuit bottoms and doing TED Talks or whatever. These are people who have learned a lot about industry, and generally about the industry that they're a part of. And that kind of age brings experience and knowledge and wisdom and knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. And that's what allows them to be successful. The same applies for Nobel Prize winners. The average age of Nobel Prize winners is basically increasing every single year, because you can't be creative until you've mastered a domain. It's not on the cards. The only exception to that was in the early 20th century in physics, when they were basically deleting the whole of the old physics. So at that point, all of that old knowledge became obsolete. When they were moving from Newtonian to Einsteinian physics, the fact that, your old guy who was 65 years old knew loads of Newtonian physics versus the 25-year-old who hadn't learned the Newtonian physics in the same level of detail made no difference, because the Newtonian physics was being kicked out. So it's about learning the new thing. So it's, the creativity is to an extent, well, not to an extent, to a massive extent, it's going to be a function of the stuff that you know in a particular area. Artists, exactly the same. If you look at, Picasso, right, tremendously creative, very exciting. But if you look at Picasso's early work, it's very standard. Picasso's early work is very formal. It follows the conventions and the rules, and you can tell that he's just mastering the craft. And then if you trace his work as time goes on, you see slowly changes start to creep in, and then before you know, you've got something that's completely unrecognizable. But that's not as a model. What that means is that you know quite a lot of stuff, and then you grow and you get better, and here you are. So if there's something, what people need to do is they need to define the thing they want someone to be able to do, and then explain how it's not just going to be a function of stuff that they've picked up and learned over time, and also point to experimental evidence that suggests that such a thing's possible. Chess is the classic example the cognitive scientists use is chess, where when you think about a grandmaster chess player, you think about someone who is anticipatory, who is tactical, who's always thinking 15 steps ahead, who's looking at their opponent and reading them and figuring out the kind of play that they're going to make, that kind of stuff. And you'd expect them to be, if transferable skills were a thing, you'd expect them to be able to do that in other domains. Weirdly, we don't have any chess grandmasters who are currently running our armies, which would, if the theory worked, would make sense. But more importantly, when the scientists looked at the differences between chess players, the reason why they like to experiment on chess players is because their ability is ranked. So every elite level chess player has a rank, so it's very easy to see who's better and who's worse. Basically, the main difference between elite chess players is their knowledge of board setups. So your average grandmaster chess player will know 50 to 60,000 board setups and the right next move. Not necessarily why, not necessarily the right next 10 moves, but the right next move. And what that means is that they can look at any board and just know what the right next play is. Not necessarily because they're thinking 2 steps ahead or looking at their opponent or whatever, but just because they know this board and they know from this board the right next play is X, Y, or Z. And so it really just, and obviously there's other mental stuff going on in there, that the way that they can retain all that information and their central executives functioning and figuring out what kind of board we're looking at, how quickly they do that and stuff like that. But broadly, what we're looking at is the ability to just, not the ability, but just that massive bank of knowledge.
And the 8-year-olds who sometimes beat the grandmasters, even though they don't have that bank of knowledge and they haven't looked at as many chessboards, those are flukes or outliers or lapses in concentration or something like that, or not worth talking about?
Yeah, it's not normal. It's not normal. Do you know anyone like that?
I know that I think an 8 or a 9-year-old recently beat Magnus Carlsen in a speed chess tournament. Which, like,
I don't know.
I don't know if that's enough to be a pattern or to like disprove the theory. Maybe Magnus Carlsen wasn't paying attention that day, but
I don't know. All much get right. Like it's if someone comes up with a better plausible explanation, right? The only more plausible explanation is that this child is just way more creative, like way more anticipatory. Their ability to like think a bajillion steps ahead is just like next level, or whatever. And then you'd expect this child then to do all sorts of amazing things, but that never happens, right? They tend to be really, really, really good at chess, right? They don't end up being then expert, violinists and startup founders and CEOs and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, hard cases make for bad law and all that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So when you are thinking about a classroom setting and you're trying to impart the combination of the right facts to the students to allow them to use these schemas and to learn, you're a science teacher, so to learn science or to really to learn anything though, how do you go about doing that in a way that is best optimized for the outcomes you want? How do I be a good teacher?
I mean, this is my life's work. And it's not something that you can solve or impart easily. It's a tremendously complex thing. Not just because learning is mysterious and depends on variables that are outside of my control, but because I have 30 of those in front of me. So it's a very complex activity, I guess.
So what are some of the big misconceptions then that you see out there in the world when people talk about teaching or education or things like that you would want to debunk or dispel?
There's tons. One is the transferable skills thing that we just spoke about. Again, if we're talking to a generalist audience, the most common one is learning styles. So that different students have different learning styles, but different people have different learning styles. You probably did a learning styles test when you were in school, where you get tested to see if you're visual, audio, or a kinesthetic learner. And here the list has now since been expanded. And I kid you not, there are also haptic learners who learn best by touch. And there are olfactory learners who learn best by smell. And there are gustatory learners who learn best by taste. This is, yes, I know. This is a nonsense. If there's one thing that your listeners should take from this, is that you, my friend, are not special. Nobody is special. Most of us, most of the time, learn in pretty much exactly the same way. Now, it could be that there is some information that by definition or inherently is best transmitted in a certain way. So, for example, if I wanted to teach students what Beethoven's Fifth sounds like, I have to transmit that information audially. If I want to show students what a volley looks like, I have to show them kinesthetically, and they have to practice kinesthetically. That doesn't mean that there's a third of my class that actually needs to learn about volleying audially or whatever. So there are things that are best presented in certain different what are called modalities or ways, but that doesn't mean that individuals are special in any kind of regard. The same applies for things like Myers-Briggs tests, or what's the other one? Is there Gardner's something? What's the Myers-Briggs one?
That's MBTI.
Yeah, whatever. I think most of these
and other personality tests like that.
Yeah. Most of these are nonsense. Both
nonsense with regards to learning, or nonsense.
Oh, everything. Yeah.
Say more.
Different people are different, right? That's not surprising. But also, most of the time, people have like a self-image of themselves. They're like, "Oh, I'm an introvert. And then if you do a personality test and it asks you loads of questions, things like, "Do you like spending time with lots of people?" And you say, "No." Do you like going to parties with really loud music? Well, I'm an introvert, so no. So it's like it becomes quite a lot of these things become self-fulfilling, but also a lot of the time personality can be reducing someone's personality to like a code is absolutely ridiculous. To start with, it's just like in a sense of just understanding human dignity. It's a name. But more than that, is people's personalities change depending on context. So someone who's kind of loud and confident in one context might be, kind of quiet and demure in another. We all know people who appear to be like really quiet and calm and turn out to be like massive party animals or whatever in a different context. If there's something like, I seem very confident and outgoing when you're asking me these questions because this is terra firma for me. Like, I know loads of this stuff, but if you start asking me questions about things that I'm not as confident about, you'll see my physical behaviors start to change, and the way that is expressed start to change. And you could, reasonably conclude from there that, this character is a little bit different there. There are some things I get really cross about and some things that I really don't. So some people that I get really cross at and some people that I really don't. Does that mean that I'm a cross person or not a cross person in general? There are some things that really upset me and some things that really don't. Does that mean that I lack emotional stability or I have emotional stability? So trying to reduce that to a sheet of paper with a scale where I'm ranking myself and then giving me a code at the end and saying I'm an empathic, teleporter or whatever these terms come up with. Like, I don't know what the point is. I think A, it's nonsense. B, it's like, it just is so reductive about what humans are really like. And C, it doesn't make any difference to anybody's life anyway. Like, what difference am I, like? Okay, I know somebody's Myers-Briggs code. Does that mean that, like, I know a priori how to deal with them? Obviously not.
Hmm. I'm on the fence between like trying to bring examples that might like challenge that versus amplify. I'm interested because I know I've had conversations with people where saying like, yeah, when I've done Myers-Briggs, I came up as a blah and you came up as a blah, and like that gives you a common metaphor that you can use in your conversations, or in that conversation right now. And like the proof is in the pudding that when the two people say like I identify with this one or I identify with that one, they have a sort of common cause or a common language which they can then use. And it doesn't mean maybe that those traits like play through into every element of their lives or that they'll never change, but it gives you a shared set of metaphors that we can use. Like when someone says, I'm a Potter fiend, and then they go, oh, you're a Ravenclaw, you go, oh no, I'm a Slytherin. And they kind of know bits about what they mean in a way that's just useful for that social interaction at the very, very least. Maybe you would say that it's still like, reductive and dehumanizing, but
yeah, and like loads of people say they're a Slytherin, and you're like, oh, would you murder people? You're like, well, no, obviously I wouldn't murder people. I mean something else by that, and then you're like, okay, well, it's not a useful metaphor anymore.
I guess we're getting then into metaphor and into sort of like non-rational communication in general, right? Like I imagine that when because there's interesting cognitive science about the role of metaphor in our linguistics, and when I use a metaphor, it connects with like the physical embodiment bits that metaphor relates to. So, for example, I found some research last week that when people are holding a warm drink, they are more likely to consider other people warm-hearted. And if people tend to think that a heavier book is more important than a less heavy book, and things like that. So there's an element of like embodiment in the way that we visualize certain ideas. Maybe this is just not research you've heard of or care about, in which case we can move on. But
it's not that I've not heard of or care about. I do, but I'm like massively skeptical about a lot of that stuff. These are like the classic big sexy experiments. Like the marshmallow test and the Stanford prison thing, and psychology is going through what's called a replication crisis at the moment, where people did all these experiments and they formed psychological curricula for decades, and then when somebody else tried to do the same thing again, it didn't work. And the problem is you have what are called underpowered studies. So the groups are too small. You have things called p-hacking, which is where you basically get your data and then run your conclusion afterwards. And there are some responses within the psychological community to try and mitigate stuff like this. So using bigger studies, meta-analyses, and what's called pre-registering, which is super, super important. And it could be that those studies that you've mentioned meet all of those criteria, but until I've seen them, basically, if I see a psychology study that's got a sample size of anything less than 50, I'm not interested. And if it's not been pre-registered, I'm definitely not interested, because
What is pre-registration?
So pre-registration is where you want to write your study. Let's say you want to find out if the temperature of a beverage a person is holding makes a difference to the things that they say. You go onto a special website and you say, I'm going to do this study, and the only thing I'm going to look at is the temperature of the beverage and what difference it makes to what a person says. Because otherwise what happens is you also collect all other metrics about those people, right? So they're wearing glasses, they're tall, they're short, they've got beards, they're wearing jumpers or shirts or whatever. And then you run your data and you do your experiment and you find that, there's nothing to do with the beverage. But hang on, when I actually look at the glasses thing, people with glasses are way more likely to say that they're to be empathetic than people who don't wear glasses. So you'll publish that and you just ignore everything else that you did in your study. But because you're using small samples and because of the quirks of humans and because of the way random chance works, what you're finding is probably based on nothing and just random chance. So the idea of pre-registering is to remove a lot of that from the process.
So I'm less likely to amplify some noise in the data if I am really specific about the criteria that I'm looking to measure and the sorts of patterns that I'm expecting, something like that?
Correct, yeah. And it's difficult. These things are expensive. You have to do a proper randomized control trial. Both groups have to be blinded. You have to make sure the control group is really strong. And you have to make sure it's pre-registered and you're not, it's called p-hacking, which is where you look for one thing in your data that works or that gives you some kind of finding. There's also a problem with the way the publication works. So let's say, for example, you've done your study, which is the person with the glass of water, or whatever, and you found that there's a correlation between the warmth of the water and the empathy of the person. So I now want to test whether or not what you've done is accurate. So I do the same study myself. The chances that and I find no results. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
The chances by which I would get that published are really low, because in general the publications favor results that are exciting and favor positive results. So what you could have is you can have a situation where 50 people have done the same experiment. For one, it worked. For 49, it didn't. But the only one that gets published is the one that worked. Or maybe you got one of those 49 published, but then people are looking at it and say, well, in some studies, it does work. Whereas in reality, like in 95% of cases, it's not going to work. You just don't know about those 95. You only know about 5 and 5, and so you're saying, well, it's an even split.
Yeah, it's just. There's a thing that's happening a lot in the agile community, and I guess I'm probably like promoting it myself by having a sort of cognitive science based podcast without being a cognitive scientist myself, but of people taking like patterns or stories that they like from bits of data or from studies they've read or even published studies and saying, right, this means what I think it means, and it also implies what I think it implies, right? So it could be that there's some nugget of scientific truth that is really well powered and there's loads of people in the sample size, and now I go, right, now that neuroscience can say whatever I want it to say, and then I use it to drive some program at work that everyone has to use. Or even worse is what you're saying, which is that I might take something that is not sort of scientifically valid, it's not using good statistics, and then I might go and amplify that in the world as if it was based on something useful. And I think how do you incorporate scientific discovery and sort of modern thought on this without being caught in analysis paralysis and doubting everything that you ever read to the point where you can't try anything?
Yeah, I don't really have a great answer to this, because this is what humans do. Yeah, this is just like a natural part of being human is sampling and making assumptions. So partly that kind of baseline cognitive activity is what's kept humans safe over the last 200,000 years. If you think about like things that are dangerous, like why are people scared of spiders? Right, most spiders are not harmful, but it makes sense to just be scared of all spiders, because you don't lose much, but you stand to gain quite a bit. So nobody, when they see a spider, nobody like gets out their Pokedex and tries to figure out which spider it, as you get older you do, but when you're a child and when you're kind of your native immature sense, you just think, oh, that's scary, and you just kind of step back. And even in adults, right, people are scared of spiders, right? They don't stand there and go, well, what kind of spider is this? Should I be scared of it? What's the appropriate risk? What's the appropriate precaution? All of that kind of stuff. So we've just evolved to think in generalities and to extrapolate from a small sample, and also to think that we're right about everything. The confirmation bias is one of the strongest biases we have. It just makes us think we're right the whole time. And I don't.
I've read a lot of studies that supported that idea, the confirmation bias.
Yeah, of course. Very good, very good, very good. So yeah, like we're asking to go against human nature, and it would be wrong for me to say that I've not slipped here and made mistakes myself. And there are probably a whole bunch of things that I believe that I probably shouldn't believe. I think part of it is you can't teach someone to be a critical thinker. You can teach people general rules. So, for example, when you're reading a psychological study, check if it's been pre-registered. If it's not been pre-registered, don't read it. There we go. Right? That's a good rule you can teach someone. Are there same rules if I'm reading a paper in nanoscience? Don't know. I don't know. I've been, also part of it. Part of it is understanding how the thing works. I do a lot of, did do a lot, but everyone in education at the moment is talking about Gen AI, right? Large language models, and they're going to be revolutionary, blah blah blah. But like even a basic understanding of the way that it works tells you that it's guaranteed to make mistakes. Let's say in my curriculum, I would take a simple example. In my curriculum, it says that substances like water and hydrogen and methane are simple molecular. That's what they're called. In somebody else's curriculum, it might call them simple covalent. Okay? I want my students to call them simple molecular. But they start writing that it's simple covalent, and I ask a LLM to tell me if they're right or wrong, and it says, yeah, they're right, because the data it's been trained on shows that simple covalent is fine. Okay, so someone says to me then, well, why don't you just say to the LLM, here's my curriculum, judge them based on this? And I'm like, no, because that's not how the LLM works. You can weight it towards a particular text, but if you have it only on that text, it loses all its conversational faculties. So the reason why the LLM can, in commas, understand what people are saying is because it's been trained on billions of texts, right? If I take away those billions of texts and say, just use my curriculum, it's not an LLM anymore. It's something that can't do all that stuff. So it has to be able to do some of the LLM stuff to be able to converse and to be able to understand what the student is writing. And what that means is that by definition, I can't say, well, for content knowledge, sample from here, but for everything else, sample from there. That's just not the way the thing works. So essentially what you've got a whole bunch of entrepreneurs and people giving keynotes and talks saying that, well, we can do this and we can do this and we can do this. And even a basic knowledge of how a large language model works, how the sampling works, how the temperature of the model works and stuff like that should tell you that, no, this is a non-starter, right? You can't talk in those terms. So for every domain, but could I do something like that for machine learning algorithms? So when you're doing data crunching, so let's say somebody said to me, oh, an AI, you can take it's a different type of AI, not a large language model, but one that works on algorithms and statistical analysis, will be able to predict the extent to which a student can learn X if they have already learned Y or Z, given a couple of test responses or whatever. I don't know anything about those, so I'm not going to make any comment. I don't know, right? It's not my field. I don't know anything about those. I don't know anything about the way that they work. So I can't verify and say, does that make sense? Does that not make sense? So to an extent, there's a lot of work that needs to get done. And I guess the only advice I can ever have to people that is generalizable is don't have strong opinions about things you don't know a lot about. It's just not wise. If there's something that you know a lot about, you might find you have a strong opinion. You might find that you come out quite balanced about it. But if there's something you don't know much about, just don't. It's not wise. Because you run a serious risk of being wrong.
There's a risk the other way as well, right? Which is that if there's something that I know a lot about, there's a chance that I will be so restricted in my thinking that I'll miss useful information and useful signals that suggest that I should change my mind. So people who are deep experts in one area might find themselves over pattern matching things to their conception of the world, and they know enough about that domain that they can make everything look like it's a problem in the domain that I'm interested in, and then they also don't solve the problem, right? So I would extend your logic, which is don't have strong opinions, probably even about the stuff that you do think you know a lot about, because you're probably biasing yourself to missing stuff by having such a clear view of a complex, crazy world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge. Yeah, you form mental habits, and that makes it harder to see other things. And also part of that as well is a function of being invested, right? Like if you've spent so long thinking X, the way that confirmation bias works out is that it's difficult to turn around to yourself and say, yeah, you're wrong about everything. I think we could get quite semantic here, and I could argue that part of knowing a lot about something is knowing that that thing can change as well. So I could play that little semantic game, but I won't, because I don't think functionally it's helpful. And I think that it's definitely possible to become quite cynical, whichever way you look. I don't know if do you know Planck's law. So Max Planck is
Let's assume
great.
I don't.
Let's assume you don't. Okay. So obviously this is for the benefit of the listeners. Daniel knows what Planck's law is.
I obviously know what Planck's law is, but I'm just trying to help my listeners here.
So Planck is commenting on something called a paradigm shift, which is Thomas Kuhn's great mid-20th century philosophy of science, which is where you have these ideas about science called a paradigm, and everybody's working within the paradigm and making the paradigm better. We spoke before about Newtonian physics. That's a great example. Everyone's working within Newtonian physics, but then suddenly people start running experiments that show that Newtonian physics doesn't quite work and doesn't quite make sense. And then eventually there's enough cracks in the wall that it breaks, and you turn into the next what's called a paradigm, and you have what's called a paradigm shift. And it would be great if we were all, intellectually like perfectly honest and open to new ideas and willing to encounter a new paradigm, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, old habits die hard. And Planck's law was that a new paradigm does not arise because of the growth of, a new paradigm does not become dominant. So you have this period where the two paradigms are kind of fighting, right? So he says a new paradigm does not become dominant by the spread of correct ideas and the convincing of opponents, but by the gradual demise of those working within the old paradigm.
So everyone dies.
Yes,
and
basically.
Then there's no one else to argue for the old thing anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And we can see that playing out with so many like social progress type things, and just, like so many of the arguments that would have been had 60, 70, 50 years ago, they take a long time to play through the system. In 30 years, right, no one is going to be talking about the death penalty. Whereas even today, people every so often, there's a GB News item or whatever about the death penalty or whatever. But like in a given amount of time, like literally no one's going to talk about it, because there will be no one left alive who thinks it's a good idea.
And I wonder like the role of something we haven't really spoken about is the role of emotion and guess what the embodied cognitive scientists would call embodied cognition, which is the reason why equally intelligent, equally rational, equally informed people might have different opinions is because one group might care about a set of facts or a pattern or have maybe a kind of tribal, I don't mean that judgmentally, but a kind of tribal identity with one grouping of theories over another one, and the other group care about, this is how I see it, and I'm interested if you agree or not. But the reason why we might make, and then we channel ourselves into the kind of patterns that reinforce that. Like the reason why I make confirmation biases is that I care a little bit more about the things that confirm my existing opinion. Therefore, I'm just more likely to like overweight them, maybe irrationally, and much of the time rationally, because a lot of the time that actually helps me survive, even if it means I'm wrong sometimes.
I'm not going to disagree with any of that. Yeah, a lot of these like psychological things are evolutionary, right? The across group differences. So evolutionary psychologists talk about the way that different groups are different to each other and the way we shun outsiders. It's like a baseline racism. And without ethically or morally justifying it, you can evolutionarily justify stuff like that, because what you're doing is you're saying, well, I've got limited resources. My little group needs to work together to protect those resources. We can share those resources out between ourselves. And because there's enough of us, we can generate enough more resources per person than we could if we were by ourselves. But if somebody else comes to our group, then maybe they'll take our resources, or maybe those efficiency gains won't be made. So it makes sense for me to shun them and kick them out and potentially throw rocks and spears or whatever at them. So like, we're a red hot mess. Yeah, we've got brains that were evolved, brains that were designed to survive in a context that was for hunter gatherers and tribes people and being nomadic and stuff like that. And we put those into 21st century cities. And that's not, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that like, that will obviously lead to incongruences between the way we think and the way we would expect us to think.
Yeah, especially when so much of our nervous system is kind of an on or off switch. It's like sympathetic or parasympathetic. You're in various degrees of fight and flight or rest and digest. And our brains aren't very good at, like you said with the spider, determining when to switch off the, oh gosh, I'm in fear mode. And I'm the more I read about cognitive science, the more that domain or that scale maps onto lots of the other the decisions we make as well. And it sort of explains why I might be happier to take in some cognitive biases over others, or I might prefer some ideas over others, probably because I care about them more, and some activate my fear response more than others, maybe sub-perceptually. That's a working theory at the moment. I need to read more to find out if that's what other cognitive scientists think. But
well, it's complicated, you know, what you're talking about, like if you think about Kahneman, may he rest in peace, like thinking fast and thinking slow. My understanding is that him and Tversky used loads of underpowered studies, ironically, because they were also writing against that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure I would accept your binary model of fight or flight type stuff. I think there are periods in our life which go like that, but the majority of our time we're more complex. And whilst a nerve might be on or off, a neural network is not on or off. And a neural network seems to have properties that have what's it called? Computational irreducibility. So this is from Wolfram. I can't remember the first name of the guy, the Wolfram guy. But basically, he argues that you can't reduce complex things like a brain or a neural network down to what's going on at that basic level with any kind of sense. It's just not. It's just not physically possible to comprehend it. So I'm always on the side that people are more complex than that. Just I think.
Yeah, I guess I'm not arguing that you could explain everything in terms of that, but my perception, my understanding of it is just like with a large language model, you train it, more of those kind of responses, please, and less of those kind of responses. And then it trains itself onto what are the patterns in the things that make someone say more of those kind of responses, please. And eventually it picks up, it self-organizes to pick up on different patterns in the complexity that.
Yeah, but based on like 30 billion nodes.
Yeah.
Like nobody knows why it's picking those things and not other things. That's the point.
Sure, but we do know what makes we do input, yes, that's a good one, or no, that's a bad one. And I guess in that same way, I'm understanding it as the nervous system and the emotional regulation self-organize, like inputs into the brain and allows us to do shortcuts that say more of those kind of things, please, because they're safe and because they're nutritious, and less of those kind of things because they're probably dangerous and threatening.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's the generalizations we were talking about, yeah.
What is cognitive load?
Cognitive load. Okay, so if I asked you, what is 2 times 4?
8.
Okay, what's 2 times 44?
88.
Was 2 times 444?
888.
Was 22 times 444?
816. A bigger number. A much bigger.
It's a bigger number. Yeah. Okay. So what you just experienced is cognitive load. Okay. So cognitive load is the extent to which our brain. Yeah, it's not fun. Well, you just experienced cognitive overload, right? So cognitive load is basically just a measure of how many things our brain is thinking about once. So at a really basic level, we have our long-term memory, and we have, and that's where stuff is stored. And we also have our working memory, which is where stuff is processed. And whereas your long-term memory is it's not theoretically infinite, but it's functionally infinite. Nobody's quite worked out the limits of the human long-term memory. People seem to be able to store infinite pieces of information, and it does not seem to be the case that learning one thing makes you forget something else. So that's the long-term memory. The working memory is tiny. It's a bottleneck. It's very small. It's very constricted. You can only contain so much information. You can only process so much at once. And so what you were trying to do then, when I was ramping things up, is you were trying to do too many things at once in your head. Your brain can't do that. What your brain can do is, what your brain could have done really easily. If I said to you, what's 15 times 15? Again, you start to feel that kind of cognitive load. I happen to know that 15 squared is 225. I just happen to know that relationship. 15 squared is 225. Okay, and what that means is that makes my life quite a bit easier when I then come to do a calculation. So, for example, if I said to you, what's 15 squared times 3? You're having to do a lot more than I am. I'm just looking at that and I'm saying 675. Because I know that 15 squared is 225. I'm going to times that by 3. I'm going to get 600. 25 times 3 is going to be 75. 675. Done. So the working memory works in tandem with the long-term memory. And the long-term memory is one of the best ways to support that working memory. And that comes back to exactly what we've been talking about the whole way through. Knowing more stuff helps you think about stuff. And it helps you take in and encounter new knowledge. That's kind of cognitive load in a nutshell. That if it gets too high, you can't learn anything. And if it gets too low, you're also probably not learning anything. So there's a sweet spot. What psychologists, and especially Bjork and Bjork, so this is Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, they write about something called a desirable difficulty, which is like a sweet spot. So it's where things are hard, but not too hard. So you're not getting to the stage where you've got that bit where you're saying, I don't much care for this, but you're also not bored, and you're being cognitively pushed. Similar to exercise. Exercise is a great analogy. Like if you push yourself too hard, you're going to be counterproductive, right? Whereas if you push yourself barely anything at all, you're not going to advance in your training schedule or whatever it is. That's kind of cognitive load in a nutshell.
There's some interesting neuroscience there, isn't there, as well, about, I think when I read about this a few years ago, it's to do with getting enough adrenaline or enough acetylcholine into the system to convince your brain to change, or to convince your brain to, you need to try in order to absorb new stuff, especially once you're over 25 and your neuroplasticity dials down a bit. Is that pseudoscience, or is that a thing, or does it not matter?
I don't know. I don't know anything about it. Sorry.
I will go and do some research. So if I've got a team in front of me, let's say I'm training a bunch of agile coaches, or I'm working with my software developers, and I want them to think about their learning and development, or getting better at their jobs, or getting more skilled. How might I apply cognitive load theory to working with my team?
It's a really, really great question. And true to form, I'm semi-reluctant to answer it because it's not my world. But I can give kind of basic parameters.
Perfect.
And I guess variables that make a difference to a person's cognitive load. Okay, I think that's crucial. Okay, because if we push a person's cognitive load too far, they stop learning, they stop performing, they get annoyed and upset. If we don't push it far enough, we don't get the best out of it. So in terms of we talk about moderating variables. And different ones have different use in different contexts. The first one and most obvious is the amount of knowledge a person has in an area already. So again, if you're talking to your Stripe guy, you can tell him to do a very complex task in Stripe in few words, and he'll just get on and do it. Whereas if you're asking someone to do the same task in Stripe and they've never used Stripe before, you can't give her the same instructions. You have to change the way you're doing it because her knowledge here is different. This is what's called expertise reversal. So when a person is inexpert at something, they need to be dealt with in a very specific way. And when a person is expert at something, they need to be dealt with in a different way. So for example, when people are new to learning a particular domain, so if you're new to learning chemistry, you have to have a teacher. They have to be calm, they have to be patient, they have to be slow, they have to give you all the information that you need, so they have to let you practice it, blah, blah, blah. Whereas by the time you're an expert, like chemistry professors don't go to classes, right? If they want to learn about a new area of chemistry, one that they've not really studied, they'll just crack open a book and just work their way through a textbook or a paper or whatever. That's because they are domain experts. The way they think about it and their knowledge of it has changed. Now, so you first have to kind of anticipate where on that spectrum a person lies. You have to then moderate based on their prior knowledge. You have to moderate the amount of information, the amount of things you're asking someone to do. If you're asking someone to do 10 things, obviously that's going to be harder than doing 5 things. You have to moderate variables like distractions. If a person's got a million tabs open, they're going to be listening to you less. Their attention is weaker. Their cognitive load is going to be increased. If you're giving people distracting stuff, like if you're telling jokes, at the same time as you're giving people information, you make it more likely that they're fixated on the jokes. If you give people redundant information, that's not a good thing. And I appreciate, like, I'm doing the exact opposite of what I should be doing. I'm giving you about a million things. Fortunately, we've recorded this, so people can always go back. Redundancy is no good. Split attention is no good. Presenting things in multiple modalities can be good. So if you want to show people a diagram of something, show them the diagram, let them look at it, think about it, and then talk about it. So presenting information both verbally, so through words, and visually, that can help lowering the abstraction of things. So giving people concrete examples of a thing you're talking about makes a big difference, and that's something that's cropped up throughout this conversation. So concrete examples, analogies can help. What other stuff? Giving people external tools and supports. So, for example, if I gave you a calculator when I asked you to do that calculation, it would have been a lot easier. So that's just an external support. But if I don't have a calculator, I can give you a pen and paper, and you'd have also found it easier. So there's all sorts of things you can give people that help them to work and to be efficient. What else? Yeah, I guess
that feels like if I'm running a workshop or something and I need to present information to my team, then that all sounds like brilliant and kind of intuitive, but also the kind of stuff that we don't do a lot of the time. So we do tell lots of jokes. We do come up with like silly, playful examples that maybe may feel catching, but then also may distract. And we do provide redundant information, and we do tell you too much about the history of a topic where actually we just need you to understand some facts or some patterns within the concepts we're talking about. And if I'm thinking about like my team engaging with a task or engaging with a problem, does cognitive load come into problem solving?
Absolutely, yeah. It comes from problem solving. It was first birthed in problem solving. But yeah, the same variables apply. If you present someone with a problem, then the amount of stuff in the problem, the amount that this person knows about this problem, the amount of redundant information, the amount of distracting information, all of those, the amount of supports that you provided a person with, substantively, it's exactly the same. It maps one to one.
That excellent and giant list you just gave, is that like top of your head stuff, or is that somewhere that something that exists somewhere if someone wanted to read a little further?
Yeah, for sure. I'd suggest for a kind of a layman introduction, the place I'd start with is Daniel Willingham's book. So Daniel Willingham is an American psychologist, and he's got a book called Why Don't Students Like School, which is very good, going through the issues that we've kind of outlined. If people are more interested, then there's a book called Cognitive Load Theory, which is, I think, got copyright here somewhere. It might be a small one, but it's big, it's chunky, and it's academic. And that deals with all the different effects. And what it does is it looks at, if you present someone with redundant information, precisely what difference does that make to their cognitive loads, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about that in the context of teams who are often multitasking on lots of different things. They may have lots of different competing priorities. They are trying to solve one problem, and then another problem is thrown on top of them.
Yeah, there's no world in which cognitively that's a good thing for anybody. Like multitasking is a great example. Humans can't multitask. They just physically can't. It's just not a thing.
We don't have enough working memory. We don't have enough.
Yeah, you can move between two tasks, right? If someone gives me task A and task B to do, I can't do them at the same time. I can do task A and then task B, or I can do a bit of A and then a bit of B and then a bit of A and then a bit of B. But that always incurs a cognitive penalty, both a delay and a mistake. the only things that we can sort of vaguely multitask are things that we've automated. So when you drive a car, you are multitasking, right? But let's say I start talking to you when you're driving and you come up to a really busy junction. You'll stop responding to me, or you'll tell me to stop. When someone's walking, this is a really lovely experiment to try. Walk with someone and then ask them to solve a maths problem and watch them slow down. Right? Because the body doesn't like doing, they slow down in their walking because the body doesn't like doing, and that's just with physical stuff. One of my favorite, you can try this yourself. This is an amazing, amazing experiment. What you do is you take a text, like a sentence, not even, you could say, Daniel's podcast is the very best podcast. Okay. And
so a true sentence.
A true sentence. Yeah. And underneath every letter you put a number. So D is 1, A is 2, N is 3, etc. And then what you do is you just look at that and you say, right, you start a timer and you time how long it takes you to copy that out. Daniel's podcast is the very best podcast, and then all the numbers that go underneath. Time it, stop, write down your time. Then change it and say, right, I'm going to write the same thing. So the outcome is going to be exactly the same. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do D, then 1, A, then 2, N, then 3, I, then 4, E, then 5, L, then 6. And what you will see first is that you find it a hell of a lot harder. You'll make mistakes. And second, it takes you longer. So despite the fact that it's the same task and you'd expect it to be faster the second time around because you're more used to it, it will take you longer. And that's because what the brain is doing is it's shifting between two tasks. And anytime your brain shifts between two tasks, there is a cognitive penalty, both in terms of time and in terms of accuracy. So multitasking is very bad business. And where we have all these millions of tabs open and different communications and the Trello and the Telegram and the Slack and the this and the that and the other, whatever it is you've got open, all of those things are demanding and sucking away at your attention. And you move to one and you move to the other and you move to the third. And then before you know it, you've actually spent longer doing the same stuff and probably made more mistakes along the way.
What's the role of collaborative learning? I know in classrooms sometimes there can be a mode of asking students to learn things together, and for me that has resonance in taking two team members and asking them to go pair program on something. How does collaborative learning work?
I guess similar to what we've been saying all along, that it's often best when the people are already quite expert. I think there is some evidence that two people working on the same problem concurrently might do better than if they were separate. But in a lot of cases, it can be better to just separate those two people and let them just ask each other questions when they need to, or to have a asynchronous discussion strategy that allows them both to say their thing when they need to say their thing without interrupting the other one. It can really vary. Different teams will work in different ways. I don't think it's possible to give like a general rule other than be responsive to what's happening in this team. Don't be fixed and say, no, this team has to work in this specific way. There are times that people will just need to sit and plow away at something by themselves for 6 hours. There will be times where people need to bounce ideas around and do a hackathon and write things on the wall or whatever. But don't, I guess things have moved so far towards that side that I think my inclination would be to push it the other way and say, don't be afraid to leave people the fuck alone, right? Don't be afraid to let them just put their head down and start work without a conversation, without some hippie, project and collaborative co-worky type approach. Sometimes that might be fine and it might work. But don't underestimate the power of that individual work. What you have to be super careful of whenever you're managing a team is when one person does most of the work and the other person doesn't, or the other people don't. There's a term for it in the psychological literature called social loafing, which I really like. It's where you loaf social. And it's difficult to encounter stuff like that. And again, you have to have like really strong accountability lines, and separating people out can make a big difference. Being super clear about the expectations for each member, being clear about the group accountability and stuff like that. But also being wary and keeping a really careful eye on the people who work really hard, because they tend to hate their jobs the most.
I'm tempted to go and see if social loafing is a well-powered study and it uses those criteria or not. But that could be one for the show notes. That would be a really pass-ag thing to do.
No, it's fine. I'd welcome it, genuinely. But I imagine what you'd find is that people describe the phenomena as social loafing, and that will be entirely uncontroversial. But the individual studies where they've tried to measure it will then, or see which variables affect it, will then be like anyone can observe social loafing. Anyone who's been a member of a group knows about social loafing, which is where one person just doesn't do as much work as anybody else.
Which is almost by definition, it has to be true. Unless everyone does exactly the same amount of work, there will be someone who is either less productive or less whatever, but like that's just distribution, right?
Yeah, but there are tolerable extents and magnitudes to that distribution. You know, obviously there's always going to be inconsistency within any team, but there's a tolerable inconsistency and an intolerable one. And most of us probably have memories of intolerable one. I know that when I was at uni, I socially loafed for sure. I used to totally hang on the coattails of people who were better at chemistry than I was and let them do the bulk of the work, for sure. Don't tell UCL that. I'll take my degree note.
I wouldn't dare, because if you social loafed, boy did I social loaf. Yeah, the collaborative thing is interesting. It comes up in the pair programming conversation. We don't really have time to go much into detail there, but I think the element of like, if people should work by themselves if the task is one that's best done by themselves, don't encourage pairing and collaboration for something that's not appropriate for that. But also there, for the things that are appropriate for collaboration, encourage it very strongly and allow it to happen.
Yeah, but not just the task, also the person, right? If you've got someone who's a noob and they need help, then let them have the help. And you also might decide that there are other reasons to do it that might go beyond
knowledge.
Let's say it's more efficient for the one guy to just get on with it and do it. You might want them to do it together, because then if it breaks further down the line, you've got two people who know how to fix it as opposed to one. So it might have taken a bit longer to start with, but you've now got two people who have got the same amount of knowledge. So there's a decision that needs to be made there. But again, it's like we've been saying all along, don't let your ideology, you've read a cool pop science book about co-coding or whatever, or you've read an interview with Sam Altman and you're like, this is definitely the way to do it. We have to do it like this. Is you have to be more sensitive and sensible, and I guess more accepting that sometimes the traditional ways of working are like highly effective.
Traditional is going to have different resonances for different people there. Adam, thank you for coming on to the podcast.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Agile on the Mind podcast with me, Daniel Susser, and this week's guest, Adam Boxer. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to it on whichever platform you're using to listen. Please also consider subscribing to the Agile on the Mind Substack to receive a free weekly newsletter with this podcast, as well as articles about building intelligent teams with the help of cognitive science. You can find it at agileonthemind.substack.com. We hope to see you next time on the Agile on the Mind podcast.